I'm Ben Wattenberg. The aftershocks of the electoral earthquake of November 8th are still rumbling across the political landscape. Today we begin a two-part look at the future of America's political parties. First, the Democratic Party. Can the so-called party of government flourish when it no longer pulls the levers of congressional power? Joining us to sort through the conflict and the consensus are Robert Borosage, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, Will Marshall, President of the Progressive Policy Institute, historian Michael Beschloss, a Fellow at the Annenberg Foundation and author of The Crisis Years, Kennedy and Khrushchev, and Jeane Kirkpatrick, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, Professor of Political Science at Georgetown University, charter member of the now-defunct Coalition for a Democratic Majority, and former ambassador to the United Nations in the Reagan administration. The question before this House: can the Democrats come back? This week on Think Tank. America's oldest surviving political party has weathered rough seas before. In 1894, the Democrats were swept out of Congress, prompting one wag to remark, "There is no Democratic Party," and Williams Jennings Bryan is its leader. But the Democratic Party has also faced big challenges more recently, many of them self-inflicted.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
In the 1960s, a triumphant Democratic Party enacted a program of sweeping reforms called the Great Society. But by 1968, the party was torn apart by the Vietnam War abroad and social upheaval at home. Some observers say the conflicts of the 1960s never healed. Ideological battles continued within the party throughout the 1970s and the 1980s.
No more American hostages. No more high interest rates. No more high inflation, and no more Jimmy Carter.
Republicans capitalized on Democratic disarray with what looked like a permanent lock on the White House. Meanwhile, the Democrats held on to the Congress, steadily in the House of Representatives, and for all but 6 years in the Senate. In 1992, it seemed that Governor Bill Clinton of Arkansas could reunify the Democratic Party and take it in a new direction.
I am against brain-dead politics in both parties, and you should be too.
But on November 8, 1994, a Republican tide swept away Democratic majorities in the Senate, the House of Representatives, and state governorships. Not a single Republican incumbent lost. Many Democrats blame Bill Clinton for the big Democratic defeat. Others say it was raw voter anger. And some maintain the Republicans won because Americans are becoming more conservative while the Democratic Party is becoming more liberal. One thing is for sure, the Democratic Party and its leader are in trouble. Will Marshall, the Democratic Party is indeed in trouble. How do they come back?
Well, Ben, I think the first thing is to understand that this election closed the book on an era in Democratic politics. The New Deal coalition is finished. The agenda that Democrats have been defending for decades really is now under threat. The Republicans are taking over the machinery of Congress, and it's time for Democrats to fashion a new agenda that is competitive with Newt Gingrich and company for claiming the vital center in American politics.
Okay, Bob Borosage.
Well, I think it's clear the public's looking for change. There are real problems that people have. They're looking for solutions. And they voted for change this year, and unless Democrats become a party that is for substantial change for working people that helps them in their real life, they will have a hard time coming back.
Michael Beschloss.
I think if history is any guide, the best thing the Democrats can hope for is that the public will come around to their position on activist government. The Democrats for a half century were in favor of a government that was more active. The majority of American people were too. The issue hasn't really changed. That's still the issue that separates Democrats from Republicans. The best thing that Democrats can do is wait for a time when Americans are a lot more sympathetic to activist government than they are in 1994.
Jeane?
Well, I think it's all about the relationship between government and society, and that this has been the issue for a long time. And there was a period when people were convinced that they could improve their lives by using government as an instrument to transform society. And the government kept working on that agenda, and finally people decided, no, we've gone too far that way, and what we really want is a government that will reflect society and respond to it, not a government that will use power to try to force change. And I don't think that in our lifetimes, frankly, there will be a swing back to support for a really activist government to transform society. I think, by the way, this is happening all over the West, in France and in Britain and in Germany as well as in the United States.
Michael, what historically happens to the losing party in this kind of a, we think, perhaps transforming election?
Well, in a way it's unprecedented, because usually if there's a great party realignment such as 1860, the reason that happens is because an issue like slavery comes out of the blue sky, becomes central in American politics, and causes the parties and the party system to break up in a way that had never happened before. The interesting thing about the change this year, there's no new issue. It's still really activist government against a much more limited idea of what government does. And the difference is simply that the Democrats are no longer in the majority on that point of view, and the result is that if the Democrats decide to take a more moderate view of the way they have approached big government, let's say during the period of the Great Society or the New Deal, the result is that they are destined to be the party that the Republicans were for perhaps the 40 or 50 years after the New Deal, which is they'll be voted in once in a while, but their function will be to revise and edit what the Republicans do, not to be a majority
so
party.
So you are
in this
agreeing
country.
with Jeane that in our lifetime, at least, we're not likely to see a Democratic government.
Unless there is a great wave of support for the kind of interpretation of government that there was during the New Deal and the Great Society in 1994, that looks rather far away.
Is there anything the Democrats specifically can or should do now and in the future, say the next 2 years and beyond, to get back to this?
Ben, I think that the only thing the Democrats can do, if they want to become a party of government, frankly, at any level, is to listen more closely and respond more, clearly to the views and values of the American people. That's what we've always said for, for a long time.
And hibernate for a little while.
Hibernate. Well, listen carefully. Think it over. Yeah.
But I think the idea of getting back is the wrong one. There's nowhere to go back, and I must disagree with Michael that this is, we're simply going to be replaying a debate between big activist government and some conservative alternative, and we'll temporarily be on the downside of that debate. I think something fundamental has happened. The galvanizing issue of our time is a economic transformation that is absolutely sweeping, as important in its impact on our society as the move from an agrarian to an industrial society was in the progressive era. That is why Bob is right. Lots of working middle class folks, despite robust economic growth right now, are feeling insecure. They don't know how to cope with this new economy, the age of the microchip. It's presenting them with bewildering changes, and their old sources of security are dissolving. And what they're looking for, I think, is not either side of the old left-right debate over big government or less government. They want an enabling government. They don't want welfare state provisions, Bob, in my view, but they want government activism that helps them cope with these bewildering changes.
You were saying before, Michael, that there hasn't been a transforming election without a major event. I looked at the polls just before the election, and you saw very, very clearly, that, depending how the question was asked, but that this values issue had become the paramount issue in American life. You all have not brought it up yet. Is it plausible to you that the Democrats looking forward have to get straight on values, and that this is really what brung Clinton down?
I think it's going to help a lot, although I would probably differentiate that from something like slavery or some of the other issues that just were like a cleaver through the American political system. This is something more of a rolling change. But I think it has been the problem with Bill Clinton, who in 1992 at least feigned pretended to be a DLC moderate, but who I think if you really look at him is someone who would have much preferred to be running in 1964.
The reason that the reaction against Clinton and the Democrats was so sharp and so unequivocal in this last election was precisely because many people think he did not live up to the promise he made to be a new Democrat.
What Michael was saying.
Is that he was, when you ask people what you identify Clinton with, they said it was big government, and the most frequently cited reason was the health care plan, which indeed scared the middle class in this country. The second most frequently cited item was that he was a cultural liberal, and everybody cited gays in the military. So the public doesn't think he is anything very different from the old Democratic politics that they've been rejecting lately.
Which brings us back to the values issue. I think, Ben, that it's very significant that Bill Clinton and Hillary came into American politics with the McGovern campaign, which we thought then, you and I, because you were also a charter founder of the Coalition for a Democratic Majority.
Now defunct Coalition
we
for a
thought
Democratic Majority.
then was a simultaneously a matter of economic and political and cultural issues, and that it and was a creation of a cultural revolution as well as some different views on the Vietnam War than Johnson's or Humphreys or Scoops or somebody, Jackson. And I think that in this sense that Bill Clinton is a kind of end of that cycle, that he came in with the McGovern campaign and that he goes out, as it were, with the cultural issues.
How much of the Clinton thing is just personalistic? You hear people saying, God, every time I come into my living room, there he is on my television set, get this guy out of my house. I guess the New York Times ran an editorial that alluded to Dr. Fell, I guess a 19th century British poet named Brown, who said, I do not like thee, Dr. Fell, the reason why I cannot tell, but this I know full well, I do not like thee, Dr. Fell. Is there something about Clinton that personally, that's just getting people angry?
I think it's ideas. And the problem is that when you've got a party that is trying to be something other than what it was, like the Democratic Party, you have this situation in 1992 where people were wondering, is Bill Clinton someone who has recognized that the country has changed, that you have to have a different attitude toward government than you might have in 1964, or is this someone masquerading as a moderate in order to get elected? And the result was that when you began with gays in the military and you unveiled this very big government health care plan, it leads people to say, aha, this is a liberal who is basically a guest in his own time, until you've got a situation in which you have Democratic nominees, and he was embraced by a Democratic Party that presumably would have liked to be more moderate. Unless you have people who have the genuine instincts that really harmonize with this change in American politics, you'll see probably this kind of revulsion against a Democratic president if one is elected.
Bob Borosage, let me ask you two questions as a man of the left or from the left. Is the Democratic Party, the right wing of the left wing party, the center right, which is where that old Coalition for Democratic Majority was, where I think Will's Democratic Leadership Council was, are they they've been called not a wing of the party, but a feather of the party? Are they really out of it? And secondly, is if the party, if President Clinton decides to hang a right turn to get to that center constituency, would you, as a man of the left, back a third party run by, say, Jesse Jackson?
I think it's very much premature to talk third party at this point, but I think
he's apparently hanging a right turn.
I think you see the Democratic Party is clearly, the Democratic Party's future is as a party of middle class and working people, a multiracial party. You can't avoid that. You can't do push-off politics and pretend that's not true. And to the extent you try to go away from that, and to pretend you're something else or to become Republicans, you do what the Coalition for Democratic Majority does. Eventually you end up as Republicans. And so the Democratic Party has to be what it is. When it goes back to that base, I think people here are misreading this electorate very much. This is an electorate, as Will says, Will and I agree on this, this is an electorate that is looking for significant change, that thinks this capital city is corrupt and taken over by very large, very powerful interests that don't represent them. And they are casting about...
But you two are not saying they're the same interests.
They're casting about, I think actually we are in many ways. They're casting about looking for dramatic change. They don't have, I think, this notion that they're for a passive government is wrong, and I think to the extent Republicans give them a passive government, they won't be very happy with it. They're looking for real solutions to real problems.
Yeah, I just raised one point. We have a very static view of the Democratic Party here. I mean, in the 19th century, the Democratic Party was not associated with the vigorous use of federal power. Absolutely. In fact, it opposed that as being contrary to democracy. Party. I understand that. In the 20th century, centralization was a modernizing and progressive force, and that's why, had I been alive in the progressive era in the 30s, I would have been a strong advocate for that policy, and why the Democrats are right to embrace those policies. But we're in a new era. The party can't go back or keep fighting these old battles. And one of the good news from this election is that Bill Clinton and the New Democrats are liberated from this old status quo that was defended by powerful congressional committees, working incestuously with interest groups, with the experts who define problems and define the solutions without consulting the people. This nexus of relationships has been shattered. The Republicans are taking over the machinery, even changing the committees so they no longer can protect the old vested interests. They may protect new ones, but at least they won't be protecting the old ones.
Michael.
One problem with that is that a large part of the Democratic base, and especially the Democratic base after the election of 1994, is not going to be particularly turned on by those issues. They're going to feel rather alienated. They're going to feel the Democratic Party is beginning to slough them off. They're not going to turn out very much. If you want to, well, what I'm thinking of is if you want to see an energized system, what you want to see is two parties that really stand for a very great deal of difference. That's when you have a lot of turnout. Sometimes, as in a parliamentary system, it means that one party is destined to be the minority party for a while, but it always comes back. What I would much prefer to see is a Democratic Party that tries to address the people who are at the center of that base and perhaps does not try to walk away from the idea of activist government and waits for the time when people feel that there are a lot of problems that are not being addressed by the private sector and perhaps not by states and localities, and that wave will come back once again.
Will, has the window closed on Clinton that he had? We all agree that he had this great window, and it led people like me to endorse him publicly and write columns about it. And now these events, some of it is unfair. I mean, I think he actually did accomplish some good things. I happen to like the crime bill. I think he's in the right direction on the education bill. But the fact is that he has become somewhat poisonous in the Democratic Party. Has that window of opportunity for him shut? Is he going to be challenged on the right? I talked to you about a challenge on the left by, say, Senator Bob Kerrey. David Bourne is making, former senator from Oklahoma who resigned, is making noises that sound like an independent candidacy. My colleague Norman Ornstein says it might be backed by Ross Perot. Has Clinton's time gone?
No, it hasn't. The door hasn't shut on him. Amazingly enough, I think there is a way out for Bill Clinton and the Democratic Party. We've been probing the independent vote pretty intently lately.
You just took a big poll.
Big poll. This is the new factor. We're talking about Democrats and Republicans, left and right. People are disenfranchised by the old left-right choices. That's 30% of the electorate is resolutely independent. They don't like either party. They swung against George Bush and passive governance in 1992. They just swung against Bill Clinton, the Democrats, in 1994, but they are not intrinsically Republicans or even conservatives. And if Newt Gingrich and company don't shake up this corrupt insider status quo that they dislike so much, I would guess that in 1996, they're going to be in trouble because the independent voters aren't giving us much time to deliver what they want. So there is an opportunity for Bill Clinton to contest Newt Gingrich and company for the mantle of radical progressive reform.
But Bob Borosage, what would your, for instances, be as to what Clinton ought to do to recapture?
Well, I read Will's poll. I think the poll is right. It's just the conclusions he draws that are goofy. The poll is people are disgusted with politics as usual. You've got to put forward a program of political reform that tries to limit money in politics, campaign finance reform, changing the lobby system, and push it and make it a presidential priority, not something you try to slip over at the end of the day. Take that mantle back. You allowed Newt Gingrich to look like he represented political change in the country with term limits. That we ought to contest. You've got to go back and put forward a set of things that help people with everyday problems that they face. Now, welfare reform is, I think, replaying the crime debate. All these careful pollsters said, well, people are really for both punishment and prevention. And of course that was true, but when it became punishment and pork, They turned on the president, and the DLC members sabotaged him because they didn't want to limit assault guns. You do welfare reform when people discover that Bill Clinton thinks ending welfare as we know it costs more than keeping welfare as we have it. He's going to get killed by the Gingrich plan, which pretends it's going to save half of the welfare budget. Just people are going to see him more
to do something that will get
I
him
think you
killed?
talk up. No, I'm not. I think welfare reform is a bad subject for the president. I think you try to limit the damage that Republicans do.
Well, but he ran on it. I mean, in 1992,
It was
you
a
couldn't
bad
stop
subject
the
then,
man
too.
from saying end welfare as we know. You want to keep the welfare system as it is now?
I want to limit the damage that Republicans are going to do to poor children. I want to put forward a program that deals with the real problem that working people have as they try to go through jobs that don't have health care, that don't have security, that don't have paid vacations, that don't have child care, etc. I mean, this is a society in which middle-class people have real problems now. The president's got to talk to that, or Democrats simply aren't going to be able to have footing in this. If the answer is we can't do anything, if the answer is in this economy we can't do anything to help you, then I think Republicans will win these elections because they don't want to do anything.
What would you all do? Let's just play a little hypothetical here. What would you advise the Republicans to do in this moment of disarray with the Democrats? And I will start with you, Jeane Kirkpatrick. You are one of the few Americans extant who worked for both Hubert Humphrey and Ronald Reagan.
That's right.
So, that's right.
That's
so
right. With some enthusiasm in both cases.
In both cases, I understand that.
That's,
so what should the Republicans do?
I think that the Republicans should do what they, in fact, are doing, first of all, which is sort of reaffirming the elements of the Reagan program and the Reagan orientation. The fact is that the Republican Party is not a party of the status quo at all. And this is a very fundamental kind of a error that Democrats make, I think, even very smart Democrats. Make this mistake. The fact is that those of us who participated in it called it a Reagan Revolution. It did, in fact, rather dramatically reverse a lot of the directions that the U.S. government had been going for a long time, and it returned a lot of power to people who had been effectively disenfranchised in democratic bureaucracies and the highly structured kinds of power structures of the Democratic Party. I think that the Republicans...
Dr. Kirkpatrick, I think you're brilliant. I can't figure out what you're talking about.
Yeah, I know. Well,
you bankrupted the country in 4 years.
You don't make any sense to me either, quite frankly. When I listen to you talk about what the American people want, I think, this is what the IPS has been saying for about 40 years. This is since it was founded, and the American people, majorities of the American people, have rejected it every time they've had the opportunity. Each time they have recognized the kind of, quote, change that you're proposing, the American people turn out in great majorities and vote for the opposition. And that's what they keep doing. Now, I think there's a message in this. And the biggest message of all is leave our society alone. Respect American society. Respect American culture. And find some simple solutions to our very real problems.
Are you thinking of running for national office?
Me?
Yes.
No.
Michael Beschloss, what do you think the Republicans should do?
I think they should do what they've been doing. The Republicans, during all the years after the New Deal, basically stuck to a position which was of limited government, opposition to the New Deal notion of government that was destined to make them a minority party for a long time. Their function for roughly the 60 years after 1932 was to moderate and limit and edit some of the excesses that Democratic majorities in Congress and also in the White House committed. That's what the role for the Democratic Party is going to be likely for the next 10 or 20 years.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you, Jeane Kirkpatrick, Michael Beschloss, Will Marshall, and Bob Borosage. And thank you. As you know, we enjoy hearing from you. Please continue to send your comments and questions to New River Media, 1150 17th Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036, or we can be reached via email at thinktv@aol.com. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.